Hi, this is Ian Wright, and I'm just going to have a little talk today about stress. This is the kind of second in my series of conversations about anxiety, and I'm just going to briefly talk about stress and the stress of life. Stress is defined as actually pressure. So you can have in physics, you can have stress. A physical stress is pressure or tension which is placed onto an object, causing it to be under stress. Another way of looking at it is tension, emotional tension, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So stress equals tension or pressure. Those words are kind of quite important. One of the researchers, the earliest researchers into stress, called Hans Selye, was a Hungarian Canadian endocrinologist doctor, and he did a lot of work on stress in the 1950s, and he started to talk about this general adaptive syndrome or in stress, and looked at some of the hormonal responses to stress. But he termed, I think, quite an interesting idea, which is that of eustress and distress. So eustress is normal stress. I mean, as humans, we need certain triggers in order to want to get up out of bed for the day, normal life things. So I have to achieve this today. I need to go to the supermarket to get my food, or I need to go and get some water. These are little normal kind of stresses which allow us, pressurize us very gently into living and doing what we need to do in life. That would be what he would have classified as eustress. Distress, though, is something that affects us abnormally, and it's either one factor or a variety of growing and contributing factors that all come together and cause us distress. And this can be in an acute form, as in something stressed me out in this moment, as in, I've just had some news which has caused me some trouble, or there is this slower general adaptive syndrome, which means lots and lots of little factors that kind of go into the melting pot, which cause us to have this chronic physiological reaction. So in an acute stress reaction, we know the effects. It's, our hands tremble, our heart rate goes up, we sweat more, the blood pressure goes up. So we go into what is called a flight, fight, fright response, which is a reactive response to something, a threat in our environment, and we're on alert. The general brain alertness goes up. So something called the HPA axis, the hypothalamus adrenal pituitary axis, comes into play and stimulates this fight, flight, fright response, which pumps out adrenaline, has an effect on the adrenal cortex, pumping out cortisol, vasopressin, comes through the hypothalamus, which has effects on the kidneys. There's a direct reaction. I won't talk about that too much right now, but these direct reactions help do things like facilitate blood sugar release into the system so that we can have these kind of responses, increases our heart rate, adrenaline, constricts the blood vessels, takes the blood supply away from areas that aren't necessarily vital, just ones that are needed, like the muscles and the heart, etc., and less away from the gut. So the gut slows down in that time because it's like an acute physiological response that our body needs to get through an acute situation. And so, perfect. What happens after the stressful or threat goes is the body comes back. Actually, cortisol is quite an important hormone. Actually, it's the biggest stress hormone. But that is actually very important in allowing our bodies to restore our normal function, because it re-regulates glucose, sugar, metabolism in the body, and it regulates the immune system and the pH, the acidity, alkalinity of the body. So it helps us kind of come back. But what is the problem is when there is this, let's say, this general adaptive stress response, meaning that the body, the physiology, is never allowed to come into a point of rebalance. So it's constantly under a degree of stress. Now this is when we start to have problems. We start to become unwell, because actually, for example, there's a huge amount of different things that happen in a chronic, i.e. long-term stress response. And just to name a few, it has an effect on the immune system. So the T cells in our bodies get decreased if there is too much cortisol running around our bodies for too long periods of time. Too much cortisol actually also has a direct effect on our hippocampus, which is very important in short-term and working memory. And so it can has an effect on, and it can atrophy, as in decrease the size of the hippocampus. So that's very important in stress and elderly people. But I will talk about that in another podcast, and I want to spend quite a lot of time doing that in the future, talking about these things. So what we're really talking about is when the body goes into a long-term general adaptive stress response, and its effects on our body, mind and spirit, everything. Now, what are stressors? This is an interesting thing, because what stresses me is not what stresses you. We have every human has different things that will be classified as distressors, things that will send us into distress and having these physiological responses that I've talked about. What triggers us having difficulties? Now, there are if you talk about the classic stressors in life, the very top of the lists are relationships, families, financial insecurity, divorce, loss and grief, general security, and then there's this huge area of self-perceptions, how we feel about ourselves, and that comes into maladaptive belief syndromes, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Our health, worry about our health is one thing, but actually if we are unwell, that in itself can be very stressful. So I treat a lot of people who have various degrees of health problems and distress. Now, the interesting thing that I always talk about is it the stress that's causing you the illness, or is it the illness that's causing you the stress? And actually, normally, they totally interrelate, and it's hard to define which is worse, because it's incredibly stressful being ill, being unwell. But stress causes unwellness. So it goes around in a circle, and somewhere this circle has to be changed. Now, I'm talking about this really in terms of anxiety. Anxiety is, as I've talked about before, this is an abnormal reaction to a perceived or real threat, normally. A general anxiety. Sometimes we don't even know what is the cause of this. The anxiety, though, would be defined as actually there is no threat that's there anymore, or the threat is only perceived consciously or unconsciously, but we have this state of almost, parts of our brain, the amygdala, which I've talked about before and we will talk about more again, are sort of hyper-irritated, what we would call facilitated in this situation. So this fear, anxiety response is triggered, and this has direct effects on this HPA axis, cortisol production, vasopressin, very important hormones which actually are not helpful, in a chronic way, which I've just talked about. So I'm not going to talk about the causes of anxiety because we'll talk about that a lot more in a different time. But this idea of anxiety causing stress, a physiological stress, that is something that we need to tackle because we need to break this cycle. Again, I've talked about the beliefs, our beliefs and our self-perceptions. There are these kind of limiting or maladaptive beliefs about ourselves which are very important to work out and ascertain. And this is a huge subject, and we will certainly come back to that another time. But this feeling that we have, this kind of nociception, which is this sense of ourselves, how do we actually feel? This is kind of facilitated, I think, by our emotional response, also our internal senses. We can sense tension in our muscles, if our tummy's tight, if our pulse rate is high, how we actually feel. And that is alterable by the filter in which our consciousness reads our senses. So we have, again, which is something that we've talked about, I know, before, and we'll talk about lots, is we have our senses and we have our brain's interpretation of our senses. Now these can be external senses or internal senses. How do our organs feel? Are we in pain? Pain is very distressing and causes a stress response in us. So you've got all of these factors, external potential threats, internal senses that build up this sense of how I'm feeling right now, including our emotional state in that moment. And that makes this complex web of what we say, how we feel, how we actually are feeling, and that is often linked to this perception of that we read through our bodies. And when we have stress, we tend to feel a tension, and that is because our muscles are tighter, our blood vessels are constricted, possibly our blood pressure's slightly higher, our pulse rate's higher. There's tension in the system. Actually, this sympathetic nervous system has an effect on all of our different organs. So adrenaline has an effect on the blood supply to everything, from our muscles to every organ in the body, back to the brain. So you've got this kind of feedback loop. And when somebody is in a chronically stressed state, because of what I've said, this change in our immune system and change in the body balancing, it starts to lose its physiological balance, and weakest areas start to cause problems. So, for example, if we have a lot of tension, if we're an athlete and we are very stressed about a relationship, for example, we're much more likely to pull a muscle. Or if another part of our physiology isn't working very well, for example, our gut, and we have a tendency to gut problems, our bowels will start playing up, with irritable bowel syndrome, very important effect of a chronic, as in long-term distressed state in the body. So this alarm resistance kind of state, which is this kind of acute flight, fight, fright response, when it becomes chronic, there's a problem, and we start to go more to states of exhaustion, and exhaustion causes problems. Okay, that's all very well, but how do we change this dynamic? How do we look at changing this? The first thing I would say, and I've done a podcast on this before, is we need to develop a practice, no matter what, a meditative, contemplative practice where we can actively allow our nervous systems to find a sense of neutral, connect with stillness, and rebalance. It's physiologically very important for our systems because we are in a state of hyperstimulation. So emotional stresses, which vary as I've talked about between each person, but we are in a state of constant sensory overstimulation, and that has a hyperstimulatory effect on our nervous systems. So it causes a general adaptive stress response just walking around a city because our senses are overstimulated. So we need to absolutely find time to develop a practice, and I've talked about that in another podcast. I'd searched that one out. Other things that we can do to help ourselves are doing sports. Sports has a strongly proven de-stressing effect on our physiology by exercising the cardiovascular system, releasing tension. Very, very important to practice some kind of sport, no matter what age. Even if we're in our 70s, a gentle walk or a little bit of work on a bicycle. That is very important, not just for our cardiovascular health, but as a de-stressor, I think. Another very important element about this is talking about our stresses, finding someone who we can spend quiet time becoming conscious about what our stress is. Most of the stresses and in anxiety, a lot of our issues are actually stuff that we have are just subconscious. So we actually are not quite sure what's stressing. There's something going on in the background, and it's constantly there, nagging in our psyches. And to actually sit there and go, do you know what I am actually worried about? Health or money or whatever it is that we're worried about, if we can talk about it, it's proven to be very helpful with a loved one, a friend, or a therapist. Just bringing it to consciousness allows it to release and soften, and I think that's an incredibly important part of it. And actually becoming, with anxiety, if you actually look at what are the anxious issues, often we're anxious about something that isn't actually very real. It's a threat that has been misperceived, and actually once we become conscious of these misperceived potential threats, which aren't really threats, then that we can change that dynamic. But more about that another time. Another thing is, which is very important, is rest and sleep. Cortisol is increased in sleep deprivation. We need enough sleep. We need to go to bed before midnight, ideally an hour or two, to get the proper, especially in children, but in adults as well. We need sleep. We need enough sleep. Caffeine and alcohol have been proven to increase cortisol. So we live on alcohol, coffee, and sleep deprivation. That is the modern state, isn't it? Which we all do to some lesser and greater degrees. But actually, measuring these things and keeping them to a minimum is very important. I love coffee myself, but I try not to have coffee after lunch, because it affects quality of sleep. So finding out exactly, finding an awareness of what is stressing us, actually doing a little bit of kind of self-evaluation and saying, actually, what is my biggest stressors at the moment? Is it the finances? Is it if I feel like I'm achieving what I want to achieve? Is it worry about the family? Is it worry about the children? Just evaluating and becoming conscious and bringing a conscious awareness to stresses, I think, can make a huge difference. So there's a variety of things we can do. A big subject is stress and anxiety in children, but I will come back to that because it's too big a subject. Anyway, this is just an introduction. I'm working right now on a series of audiobooks on doing perceptual exercises to change hopefully to change and remodel anxiety patterns. And these are just kind of introductory little talks to introduce us to a few of the ideas that I'll be talking about a lot more. I wish you well.